Thank you for taking the time to watch tonight's Bible study, and I hope that you will be blessed by it. This evening, we continue a new Bible study series that I've titled In Search of the Apostles. We'll start out by looking at the group of disciples known as the 12, and then we'll follow some of them in their journeys as apostles. Now, that's where we'll start, but it won't be where we end. Using a pretty broad and inclusive definition of an apostle, one who is an agent or envoy of the gospel, I will not limit the study to just the 12 male disciples of Jesus. Jesus had women disciples too, and at least one of them certainly seems to have played the same role as the other apostles. And there's another reason to expand this study beyond the 12. If I didn't, we would miss a discussion about James, the brother of our Lord, and the Apostle Paul. And no study on the apostles would be complete without those two. And yet neither of them were part of the original 12. So again, we'll start with the 12. And for some of them, we have a lot of information about, and for others, we have very little. But we'll start with the 12, but in the end, the group will be much larger than just Jesus and the boys. Now, as we look at their stories, the stories of the disciples, the stories of the apostles, the goal is that we will be able to see ourselves. I hope that we are able to identify with these amazing but very human people and draw inspiration to follow Christ as they did. They made an impact in their world. Why can't we do the same in ours? In the first lesson, I shared some general principles of discipleship with a strong emphasis that most often it is within our ordinary lives that Christ shows up and calls us to follow him. And that's certainly what happened with most of the 12. And in our first lesson, we looked at this principle at work in the call of two sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew, and James and John, the sons of Zebedee, from the Gospel of Mark. And that account taught us that the call to follow Jesus is a call to follow him, as I quoted, in the highly specific particulars of our lives, communities, cultures, families, and vocations that we find ourselves in. Now, that was last week. Tonight, we'll begin with the one apostle by far that we have the most information on. He is known as the Prince of the Apostles. Yes, we're talking about Simon Peter. And there's so much on him that it just feels wrong to try to teach about him in one session of 15 minutes or less. So in the end, Peter will get 2 lessons, and even that feels like I'm shortchanging him. But anyway, let's dive in. No fewer than 6 names are used for him in the New Testament. Mostly combinations of Simon or Simeon and Peter, which appears to be a nickname given to him by Jesus, and the name Cephas. Also of note is that in every listing of the 12, Peter is always listed first. Early Christian history in the first century can be divided into 3 distinct stages of development, writes Tom Bizzle, author of Apostle Travels Among the Tombs of the 12. And those 3 stages are: 1, the era of the historical Jesus; 2, the time of the Palestinian church centered in Jerusalem; and 3rd, the era of the later, larger Gentile church. Peter, and Peter alone, is the only one of Jesus's early followers to have a place of prominence in all 3 stages of this very early stage of Christianity. And I think the word development is a key word when it comes to talking about Peter. From the very first time that we read of Peter to the very last we hear of him, his story is a story of development and growth. And the same should be said about us as well, right? I'll get back to that point eventually, though it might be next week in conclusion, but I'll get back to that point. Now, here are some of just a few of the highlights of Peter's story during the years with Jesus. Peter is one of what appears to be a grouping known as the inner three. It's Peter, James, and John. Therefore, because he's part of what he seems to be this inner three, he is privileged to see some of the things that the other disciples don't see. For instance, he's able to see Jesus heal Jairus' daughter. And then Peter is one of the three that gets to go further with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, before dozing off to sleep is Peter that gets to witness the intensity of Jesus's prayer to God, where his sweat became as blood. And probably the most famous of the, what I'm calling the privileged scenes of the inner three, was the opportunity to witness Jesus's transfiguration. Caught up in the moment of witnessing the glory of Jesus along with Moses and Elijah, Peter blurts out a desire to build 3 tents or to build 3 shelters. Now, we aren't given Peter's motivation in saying this. If it was just his way of offering hospitality, then maybe the criticism he received goes overboard. But if it was out of a misunderstanding of Jesus's ultimate mission that included the cross, then maybe that criticism is more justified. But clearly, however, he was not the only disciple to misunderstand Jesus, right? Peter also gets some criticism in another episode when he takes his eyes off of Jesus and becomes fearful as he took a few steps of walking on water to meet Jesus before starting to sink. Jesus, of course, reaches down and rescues him, and then he tells Peter, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" But let's give Peter a break. He certainly demonstrated more faith than any of the others. He at least got out of the boat and took a few steps walking on the water, something that none of us nor anybody else in human history has been able to do. And the final 2 episodes I want to mention are Peter's confession and then his infamous denial. At Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Followed by asking the disciples for their personal opinions as well. But it is Peter who boldly declares that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus compliments him, and it becomes part of Peter's legacy. Jesus tells him that he is blessed and that this has been revealed to him by God. Then Jesus says, "Your name is now Rock," or Petros, "and on this rock I will build my church." Thus, we are told the name Peter is more of a nickname, and the closest thing to it that we have in English is Rocky. So Peter is the nickname, Rocky. The other Gospels tell that Simon is nicknamed Rocky, but only Matthew attempts to explain why. And going back to the author, Tom Bizzle, after explaining that Matthew is the only one who takes the extra step of explaining why Jesus nicknamed him such, Bizzle writes this: It appears to have something to do with how Jesus would build his church. What Jesus actually intended has been the subject of thermonuclear Christian debate. And in this Bible study, I'm not touching that. I'm staying away from that debate. But no sooner than Peter had had his great moment, the Gospel of Matthew then tells us, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem to suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and religious scholars, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. But Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. Then, of course, we know that Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance or a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on the things of God, but on human things." And as I like to say, well, that escalated very quickly, didn't it? Our last episode with Peter in this lesson comes from the night before the crucifixion. Peter once again is bold in his insistence that all the other disciples may fall away when it matters most, but he would not. Jesus responds by telling him that before he hears the rooster crow, he will have denied Jesus 3 times. But then, guess what Peter does? Peter then doubles down by saying, even if I must die alongside of you, I won't deny you. Now, Matthew adds that all the disciples said the same thing, but it's only Peter's 3 denials that are recorded, followed by the crowing of the rooster. Peter was absolutely crushed by his actions. And after hearing the rooster crow, Peter had a complete meltdown of uncontrollable crying. Let no one doubt Peter's total and deep love for Jesus. We are later told of Jesus's forgiveness and restoration of Peter in John 21. And as many of you know, it's one of my favorite gospel stories to preach about. So, what is the takeaway? What are some of the takeaways? What's the takeaway from these gospel stories of Peter? First of all, I think we easily understand why Peter is such a favorite of so many people over the centuries. Peter is so very human. Peter is so much like us. I think Ellsworth Collis describes Peter the best when he writes that Peter is so well-meaning, so consumed by good intentions, but so terribly, terribly human. And there are so many lessons to learn from the Peter of the Gospels. But the one thing that stuck out to me as I prepared tonight's lesson was the honesty of Peter. Peter wore his faith on his shoulders. He doesn't attempt to hide from God. He is real. He comes across bold, but yet unpretentious. In his authentic love for Jesus, in his dedication to Jesus, in all of his good intentions, and in all of his stumbles, and in all of his misunderstandings, and all of his messy imperfections, we see ourselves. Back a year or so ago, when I was teaching on the Psalms, I talked about how the Psalms teach us to be honest with God. I quoted David O. Taylor when he wrote, "What the Psalms offer us is a powerful aid to unhide, to stand honestly before God without fear." If that is so, and I believe it is, then Peter is the embodiment of this unhiding. Peter gives us permission to be bold and to be real. As Brian Shelton writes, the depth of his naive optimism is an inspiration to believers and makes him a favorite among Christians. And if we get too overconfident and end up messing up, the life of Peter teaches us that that isn't the end of the world, and Jesus still journeys with us. The story of Peter teaches us that even when we fail, those failures never get the last word. Instead, it is grace that gets the last word. And that seems to be a good place to end for tonight. We'll have at least one more lesson on Peter before we move on, because there's a great bit of Peter's story that is told outside of the Gospels. And we'll cover that the next time.